Hi everybody, and welcome to the virtual lesson today. Today we're going to be talking about fiction versus nonfiction literature. So why is it important that we know the difference? First of all, it helps develop your questioning stance. If you understand what type of literature you're reading, you can better ask those important questions. Secondly, this helps us group books into categories, right? So if you are looking for a book to write an essay about, you know that you need to look for nonfiction versus fiction. It also tells us if this book is informational. So is this something that I can use, like I said, in a formal essay? Is this something I can use to study for an exam, right? And how do I quote this book in an essay? Are you writing an literary analysis essay, or are you writing an informational essay? So these are important things that are reasons why it's important to know the difference between fiction and nonfiction. So what is fiction? The actual definition of fiction is literature in the form of prose, especially short stories and novels, that describe imaginary events and people. Okay, so this is an important little star at the bottom here. It's only some aspects need to be imaginary for a book to be considered fiction. We'll talk a little bit later about different types of fiction and nonfiction and how it can sort of get confusing. But it's important to know that even though maybe the setting is realistic or the character is a person that did exist in history, if any of the aspects of the story, the plot line, the problem that the characters run into are imaginary, it's considered fiction. So what is nonfiction? So here are some elements of nonfiction listed for you, but the definition of nonfiction is prose writing that is based on facts, real events, and real people, such as biography or history. So biography and history are two of the biggest, pretty clear-cut examples of what nonfiction is. So if you're writing a story about someone's life who actually lived, that's nonfiction. But like it says in our little picture here, this can vary on book to book. So what is the author's purpose? Are they trying to inform you about this person, or are they trying to persuade you about this person or event or whatever else it's talking about? You have to look at the author's perspective. So, for example, if you're reading a biography about a person and the author is somebody who's related to them, that author might have a biased perspective on the life of this person. The main idea. So what is the text about? This functions similar to a thesis statement, like in an essay. What do you want to tell people? What's your motivation for writing this? And then supporting details, obviously ideas that support the main idea. So what kind of research did they do? What kind of examples did they give, etc., etc. So speaking of examples, this is a pretty basic list of some fiction or nonfiction books. So for example, a fictional book is Harry Potter. It takes place in a fictional world. All of the people are made up. All of the, characters and the magic and all that stuff is all made up. So we know that that's fiction. What is nonfiction would be a biography about J.K. Rowling. So we have one here, J.K. Rowling from Welfare to Billionaire. This is using the real life version of what J.K. Rowling went through in her life before she wrote the book, what happened after she wrote the book, why she wrote the book, things like that. So another example of fiction here, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. So this is an example of historical fiction, which we can talk about later. But this is basically taking real historical figures and putting them into an imaginary situation. So obviously Abraham Lincoln wasn't actually a vampire hunter, but it does take place during Abraham Lincoln's actual lifetime. So again, a nonfiction version would be a biography of Abraham Lincoln. This tells also about Abraham Lincoln, the person, the real person, but it uses actual events, real historical, proven facts about his life or things that he did, things that can be proven through history. Again, Pride and Prejudice, great book, but fictional. None of those people were real. They might be based on real people that Jane Austen encountered in her life, but they're all imaginary. An example of nonfiction is Into the Wild. So this is a book written about someone's adventure, and they felt that it was important that they write down what happened and how this adventure changed them. So short stories are also usually fiction. Again, we can have some creative nonfiction, which we're going to talk about in our next slide. That can be short stories, but generally they're fictional. Nonfiction textbooks, right? So anything that you have to read for a science class, a math class, things like that, those are all nonfiction. Those are real, proven facts that you're using as an informational text. So here are some things that can be a little bit tricky. So realistic fiction and historical fiction. We sort of already went over this, but essentially these are still stories and they still follow the typical narrative of, exposition, plot, climax, resolution. They have characters, things like that. But they are taking real events, real people, real time periods, and inserting them into that narrative. So you can read a book that takes place in World War I, but if it's historical fiction, then even though those characters or the things that they go through are based off of real things, they are made up, they're imaginary. So they're using a real life basis to create something fictional. So that's where it gets a little confusing, but I'm sure you guys can get it. So the story plot is fictional, right? Even if these contain real locations or real time periods, and again, even real people, like we saw with the Abraham Lincoln books. So creative nonfiction. So this is, like I said, Into the Wild, for an example. It's a non-fictional story that is written like fiction. So it contains characters, it contains dialogue, it contains plot and events and problems that need to be solved, things that we all see in fiction, but these are based off of true events. Essentially, somebody is taking these true events and writing them in a prose-like narrative. Okay? So I want to talk a little bit more about nonfiction because I think this is the one that you guys may not have realized how much you've come into contact with it. Textbooks, like I said, are all nonfiction. Other things that are nonfiction are anything that is considered an informational text. So this can be newspapers, this can be articles, this can be essays, this can be cultural critique. Okay, so although textbooks and articles are a great example of nonfiction, this doesn't mean that nonfiction is always cut and dry, boring, no opinions, right? So we can have articles that have opinions that we might not really be aware of. Again, that helps you, back with our first slide, helps you with your questioning stance. And it also can be persuasive, right? So we saw on our elements of nonfiction, we need to take into account who the author is, what direction they're trying to go with this story, and why they're telling this story. What about this story makes it important for them to tell versus other ones, okay? All right, so after you've gone through this, you should be able to take this quiz that's linked here, and I wish you all the best of luck. Thank you.